Hello and welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many folks in the audience joining us today. I'm very excited to be hosting the Ocean Lectures series program for all of you today. It's been a wonderful series so far, and we're really excited to be joined by our host, Dr. Peter Ross, and our presenter and award winner, Dr. Brett Howard, today. I would like to start off today's program by saying how grateful I am to be teaching, living, and learning on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people here in Vancouver at the Vancouver Aquarium, where I'm hosting from. And that it's by working with our local communities and incorporating those best practices of caring for the land that we're living on that we can offer the best programs through conservation, education, and research through OceanWise. So we're so grateful today to have Dr. Peter Ross, our Vice President of Research for OceanWise hosting, and I will turn it over to you to tell us a little bit about the awards and Dr. Brett Howard.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. These are very unusual times. We all acknowledge that 2020 is a year perhaps to be forgotten. But we at OceanWise are delighted to be holding the 25th Annual Ocean Awards. These were started as a tribute to our founding executive director for the Vancouver Aquarium Marine Science Center. That was Murray Newman. He was executive director from 1956 to the early 1990s. And the Ocean Awards were launched in 1995. As I said, this is the 25th annual award season. And unfortunately, rather than having a gala at the Vancouver Aquarium with music and fine dining and wonderful camaraderie to showcase our winners, we were compelled to come up with a different formula. The formula this year was an online gala wherein we had the keynote speaker, that was Dr. David Suzuki. And he was our North medalist for his lifetime contribution to environmental conservation and his illustrious career. We announced all of the 6 other Ocean Award winners at that point in time, but we reserved a dedicated hour for their participation in this showcase formula for the time since then. And today, delighted to have with us Dr. Brett Howard. She is the 2019 Ocean Award winner for outstanding student research, and that reflects her PhD that she achieved in 2019 from Simon Fraser University. I'm going to hand it over to her to introduce herself and her topic, but I do want to emphasize that the Ocean Awards are a recognition of accomplishment in a number of different sectors. Clearly, research and conservation leading to engagement and education and outreach is critical. And any of our award winners, from our award winner in research or conservation or communications, all of these candidates have demonstrated their ability to conduct their role in delivering science in different ways to an audience at hand. So, Brett, congratulations on being this year's, and that is 2019, the 2019 Ocean Award winner for outstanding research as a student, reflecting your PhD. And we're certainly delighted that you've been able to find a wonderful position with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to continue your work on invasive species. So over to you, Brett, to tell us a little bit about what invasive species are, why you're interested in them, why you're worried about them, and what you've been able to achieve to deliver science in ways that can hopefully contribute to solutions on the invasive species front in coastal British Columbia. So congratulations, Brett. I'm going to hand it right over to you, and I'll just ask the audience members to please interrupt, but only using the chat box. So interrupt by sending a chat message into the chat box, and we'll hold that until Brett has finished her talk. So Brett, over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you today. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. And presenting view, is that working for everyone? Yeah, awesome. Okay, yeah, so today I'm going to talk, as Peter said, about work I did in my PhD. I am presenting on just one component of a much larger body of work. This particular project I did in conjunction with my colleague, Dr. Fiona Francis, and my supervisors, Dr. Isabel Cote and Tom Theriault. And that was a collaboration between SFU and Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Before I get into the details of what I'm talking about, I will hopefully change slides. There we go. Just a little bit of background about myself. I did my bachelor's at the University of Alberta, and then I went and did my Master of Marine Management degree at Dalhousie University, and that's where I really discovered an interest in combining science and pure science and interesting questions with practical and applied policy issues, and so that's where I like working, and that's why working with DFO now has been a real treat, because I can bring those two things together. Like I said, talk more about invasive species in a minute, but invasive species for me are very much that meeting point between science and policy and management, and so I've quite enjoyed the work, which hopefully you'll get a flavor for as I talk about it today. I've also had a few other experiences that I'm also happy to expand on if there are people, young career scientists in the audience who want to talk about that later as well. Done some consulting work for ESSA. I taught at the British Columbia Institute for Technology for a short period of time. And like Peter Ross said, I'm now working as an aquatic biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So invasive species are on the rise globally, and they're a leading cause of biodiversity loss. There are thousands of invasive species, and this here is just a collage of sort of the top 100 worst invasive species as identified by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. On this collage of 100 animals, most of them are actually terrestrial, and only 8 are marine species. However, if you look at all of the invasive species out there and all the literature out there, there's a thought that coastal environments are probably some of the most invaded in the world. And so that's, although there are only 8 of the worst on this list, I think that underrepresents the threat that invasive species pose to coastal and marine ecosystems. Quickly, before I get into the meat and potatoes of the research that we did, I just want to walk through some basics of invasion ecology. This here is what we call the invasion process, and I won't go into it and I won't labor it, but basically the idea is that lots and lots of species are transported by humans all the time to new locations. But that doesn't mean every single one becomes what we would consider an invasive species. There are a lot of things that species has to get through before it gets to that last stage. So it has to arrive alive. There have to be enough of them to start a breeding population. From that step, when they start to spread, that's when we start to get more concerned about them in a practical sense, because at that point, we're more likely to start to see impacts. Impacts are what I'm going to talk about today, specifically the interaction between a native species on our coast and an invasive species from Europe. I'm going to go back, just give you one definition. Invasive can be a bit of a difficult term for people to wrap their heads around. Like I said, not every species that's introduced becomes invasive. So in the case of this presentation, invasive species here is going to mean an introduced species that is demonstrating range expansion and is having significant impacts on other typically native species. In practice, impacts could be positive or negative, but realistically, we're more worried about the negative impacts. And those negative impacts can occur at any level of biological organization. So for example, you could have a single invasive predator species that has a really detrimental effect on a single population of a native prey species. But then that scales upwards, and you can have an invasive species that affects whole communities of organisms. And even further, you can go up to the level of ecosystem. And I'm going to talk about an interaction between an invasive species and its effect on a whole ecosystem today. This picture here is actually a picture of Hawaii, and I bring Hawaii up because it's a good example of the impact of an invasive species on a coastal ecosystem. You wouldn't think it, but mangroves are actually invasive to Hawaii, and they take over huge areas of coastal wetland and really affect the way that processes like sedimentation and erosion occur. But further than that, they also practically affect native species like birds from nesting properly. So that's one example of an invasive plant that can completely reshape an ecosystem. But animals will also reshape ecosystems through their behavior. This is the Chinese mitten crab, which is not the species I'm going to talk about today, but it's a good example. The Chinese mitten crab is invasive in Europe and in the United States as well, southern United States. And the problem with Chinese mitten crab, they live in rivers and they really like to burrow. And so this is an example of the burrows that Chinese mitten crab will create. And this will really affect the structural integrity of the bank. It'll cause sedimentation, erosion, destabilization, all of these things. So both plants and animals, invasive plants and animals, can completely restructure ecosystems. So the ecosystem that I'm concerned about, and the one that I'm going to talk about today, is the ecosystem that is supported by common eelgrass, which is a species that we have sort of in abundance here in British Columbia. And if you've ever done any beach walking, you've almost certainly come across eelgrass while you've been on the beach. Eelgrass is native to North America and Europe. And it is a critical habitat, and it's critical because it, as a structural component of an ecosystem, it creates a habitat for a huge range of species. Most notably, probably, is juvenile salmon. It's pretty well known that juvenile salmon benefit from eelgrass. It provides shelter and food, and so they can live in eelgrass and grow until they're ready to head out into the ocean, open ocean. But it supports a huge range of species. This includes Dungeness crabs, juvenile Dungeness crabs in particular, often live in the eelgrass, and wading birds are really reliant on eelgrass habitats, particularly when they're migrating. So because of the importance of eelgrass to all of these species, as well as nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, stabilizing banks, these are all things that eelgrass does. And because of that, there are a lot of initiatives in BC to both protect and restore eelgrass. Unfortunately, eelgrass is threatened by a huge number of stressors. If you think about all the activities that humans do on the coast, building docks, building ports, even just driving your boat through with the prop wash going through an eelgrass bed, all of these things are bad for eelgrass. And unfortunately, the European green crab, which is the invasive species that I study, is an additional stressor to these ecosystems. This is the European green crab. The figure on the right-hand side there is like the average size for a female in coastal waters in British Columbia. They can be identified by the 5 spines along the side, as well as the 3 bumps between the 2 eyes on top of the carapace. I caution, if you're out and looking and you think you see one, I caution against using color alone to identify a green crab, because they actually have a bit of a range of color morphs. And of course, we have our own crabs in BC, our native crabs in BC that are also green. So that's how you identify a green crab. As the name suggests, they are from Europe originally, but they have a global invasive range. They have been spread around the world since going back to the 1800s. They are, however, fairly recent to our coast. They were initially introduced in San Francisco Bay Harbor and slowly made their way up north. to us. And then in 1997, 1998, they were first observed on Vancouver Island. So they've been here for 2 decades or so at this point. This is a figure showing all of the locations that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, as well as their collaborators, have ever trapped for green crabs since they started looking in the mid-2000s. You'll see very clearly that the green crab are really well established on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And they stayed there more or less for a while, but we've seen spread now over the last few years. Most concerningly, we're seeing them increasingly in the Salish Sea. And just this year, we had the first reports of green crab on Haida Gwaii, which is of concern. Importantly, green crab are an intertidal species. They aren't subtidal like Dungeness or red rock crabs, so they're intertidal. And as a consequence of this, they're commonly found in eelgrass meadows. Before I move on from this slide, I'll just say that if you're interested in where green crab are being found in British Columbia, you can go to our open data site, so open.canada.ca/data, and just search green crab, and it'll take you to a similar map as this that you can kind of click through and look at your leisure. Okay, so the reason that I was interested in the interaction between eelgrass and green crab is because there are a handful of studies that came from the Atlantic coast, where these two species also co-occur as an invasive and native, that demonstrate that green crab have been really quite bad for eelgrass on the Atlantic coast. So on the left hand of the screen there is a figure from Maine. And in the yellow there, it shows all the eelgrass that was lost since 2001, 2002, and when the paper came out. And this was linked to an increase in the number of green crab in the area. A number of other studies have demonstrated the link even more closely. A paper by Garbery et al. Is the photograph on the right there. And all of that at one point was eelgrass. And you can see what green crab have done is they've come through and they've dug through the sediment looking for prey, which are bivalves, and you can see the shells littered throughout that photo, and they've pulled up all the eelgrass in the process. It goes beyond just predator-prey and losing that habitat in that it then affects all the things that live in that habitat, and Kyle Matheson and his collaborators showed that there was a decrease in fish communities and a change in fish communities after green crab had affected eelgrass in Newfoundland. So all of these together made me very concerned about the impact of green crab on our own Pacific eelgrass here. I was fortunate enough to do a PhD through SFU in collaboration with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and I spent 3 wonderful summers heading out to Barkley Sound primarily. I'll show a map of that in a second. And I trapped a lot of green crabs for a lot of months. We had a great time, and my curiosity about green crab has not stopped since then. And in the process of that, I did the work that I'm going to present today. And essentially what I wanted to know is, do green crab have a negative impact on eelgrass habitats in British Columbia? And if so, how is that impact mediated by density? Green crab they can occur in really low densities at a site, and they can occur really high densities at a site. And so I wanted to include a density component to this question. So we did this by heading out to Barkley Sound, which is the inset there, and we found ourselves a nice eelgrass bed, and we set up some cages to see what happens when green crab are let loose on an eelgrass bed. For those who are interested and want the nitty-gritty details, this all came out in a paper in Biological Invasions, which I'm showing here. And if you can't get a hold of it, if it's behind a paywall or something, feel free to email me and I can share it. So yeah, we set up these 4 different treatments. We had an empty enclosure, which had no green crab in it. We had a low density enclosure, which had 1.4-ish green crabs per meter squared in it, high density. And then we had the ambient number of green crabs. So there are already green crab in this bay. We obviously didn't want to introduce green crab to a place where they weren't already occurring. So there was an ambient no enclosure treatment as well. This is what the cages look like, and these are my colleagues, Dixon Wong and Fiona Francis, setting up a cage while I casually take pictures. And then below that is a picture of Fiona doing the actual hard labor of counting eelgrass shoots, which we did over the course of a month in all of our cages. And I feel terrible every time I show this picture because she worked her butt off and I just sat on a boat. So props to Fiona for doing all of that diving. I'm going to jump right into results here. This is the big result. So you can see all of those same four treatments on the left-hand side, right-hand side there. And this is the average eelgrass shoot density per meter squared over the course of the month of August. Now, first of all, just clarify that all of the treatments declined, and that is because we ran the experiment in August, and there's just a natural senescence. The plants are just dying because it's coming to the end of the growing season. So we saw a decline across all of the treatments. However, the low density ambient and zero crab treatments were not significantly different from each other. Whereas the high density treatment, you see a serious decline, a really rapid decline in eelgrass quite quickly, just within a matter of like the first couple of weeks, we saw a huge decline. So obviously that's concerning. But practically speaking, I think the next question that a lot of people ask me is, well, how high is high? 5.6 crabs per meter squared, that sounds high. Unfortunately, we don't really have good density measures of green crab all over the coast. It's just not how we count crabs. We count them by putting in traps. So what we end up with is what's called a catch per unit effort, which you can think of as the number of crabs caught by a trap per day. So that's what I've got shown here in this figure. You can see that in particular, we've got these really high numbers on the west coast, Vancouver Island, where the green crab have been established for the longest period of time. And while you do have a lot of sort of average sites, there are these handful of sites that I think of as hyperabundant, where you get an incredible density of green crab. And there aren't a ton of these sites, but where they are, there is, of course, eelgrass to be concerned about. And as these green crab are spreading, we're concerned about hyperabundant spots like this, hot spots like this, cropping up in the Salish Sea or up in Haida Gwaii, places like that. So just to put it all in context, I personally have counted over 1,500 crabs in one day at one site. So yeah, you can get really high numbers of crabs at a single site. It's possible. So in conclusion, I would say that ecosystem impacts are definitely possible as a consequence of green crab, maybe not on their own, but certainly in conjunction with all the other stressors that we put on eelgrass beds. They certainly don't need the added pressure of green crab coming in and tearing up all of the eelgrass. And again, you have to think about this not just in terms of the plants, the individual plants, but that whole ecosystem. Eelgrass supports a huge diversity of animals, right down from the little infauna that are the basis of a lot of food webs, to those very precious salmon that, of course, I'm sure most people on the call are very aware of how important salmon are to British Columbia. And I've put the killer whale in there as a sort of placeholder for all of the value we place on salmon. And so causing anything that damages eelgrass has a ripple effect. And I think personally that green crab are definitely on that list of stressors. I'm sure some of you are wondering what you can do about the issue of green crab and other aquatic invasive species in British Columbia. Please report any sightings to AIS Pacific at dfo-mpo.gc.ca, especially if you're finding green crab in places that we don't already know where they are. So we know they're on the west coast of Vancouver Island, but we're really interested in those areas where they're spreading, the Central Coast, Haida Gwaii, Salish Sea. Please take photos, and if you can, GPS coordinates. Note the date and any identifying features. If you can just take a photo, that's preferred because we don't want people accidentally killing native species that we want there in the ecosystem. So photos are the best way to document your find. And yeah, we'd love to hear about them. The other thing you can do is support local organizations that are working on green crab mitigation. This is an incomplete list of all of the organizations that collaborate with DFO and work with us and have their own green crab sort of projects going on. If you are aware of any of these, if you're interested in finding out more, I'm sure they would be more than happy for you to reach out and ask them questions about their projects and their programs and what they're doing about green crab. And of course, I'm always happy to answer questions as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you first and foremost to OceanWise for this award. It has been a real honor. It's been quite a group of panelists or talks, and so I'm honored to be part of that list. And it's great to be able to share this information with all of you as well. So thank you for coming in and listening to this talk. Just briefly, I want to say thanks to all the people that worked in the field for this data. It was a very labor-intensive project, and we had a lot of great help. And finally, thanks to the funding organizations, SFU, the Canadian Aquatic Invasive Species Network, the Banfield Marine Sciences Center, which is where we actually did the research out of, and I'm wearing their shirt today, and the Fisheries and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, of course. So with that, I am happy to turn it over to questions, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Brett. Certainly a wonderful talk, a great PhD to launch you in your career. A student of life, I'm suspecting you're going to be learning for a long time yet about the ocean around you. So thank you for joining today and sharing your experiences, your thoughts, your expertise with the group. We have lots of questions, and you spoke to some of the, you provided some insights into some of these questions already, but perhaps what you can do is simply reiterate or roll up or accentuate some of the answers because I'm going to simply draw from the chat room here. And I'll start with one here. It's on everybody's minds. You spoke a little bit to it, but let's roll up our sleeves on this one. From Linda comes the question, are there any solutions to the green crab explosion? So I'll general question, but obviously that's front of mind, and that's something that you can speak to.
Absolutely, yeah, that is a common and very welcome question, obviously. So the green crab explosion right now, I have to say, has been. Maybe I'll just draw from the example of Haida Gwaii in particular. That discovery was made just a couple of months ago, and of course, we're in the middle of COVID, and everything's a little bit more difficult than it needs to be right now. And the Council of the Haida Nation, as well as Parks Canada up there and other partners, they came together right away, and we sent them traps, and they've been out trapping and trying to. The first step is just to figure out how widespread they are. We call that delineation trapping. So they're doing that right now. They're just trying to find out like how far green crab have spread, and then we'll go from there. The next step in the process is management trapping. There's really no way to eliminate green crab entirely, possibly from a place like Haida Gwaii, which is isolated, but in general, it's a marine species. It's going to go where it wants to go. It spreads via larvae. There's not much we can do to control that. But what we can do is when they're in their adult phase, in the intertidal, we can reduce their numbers, especially in places where we're particularly concerned. So if we want to protect a particular eelgrass bed, we'll try to increase the trapping effort in that bed, for example. So once we have a better sense of where green crab are in Haida Gwaii, the next step would be to do that management trapping to reduce their numbers, and in particular in areas where they are causing us the greatest concern. Does that answer the question?
Oh, I'm sure it does, and we're going to keep on going here. And I think the solution orientation is going to be critical through multiple questions here. So let's keep them coming. Here, another question. Have you seen a higher number of other invasive species move into areas where the green crabs are present? In other words, if the green crabs are so destructive and they tear up the natural habitat in a certain ecosystem, does that make that ecosystem more vulnerable to being invaded by other species or altered?
That's an awesome question. That's the idea of the invasion meltdown, where one species facilitates another invasive species, and you get a complete radical shift in the community or the ecosystem. To be honest, I don't think we know the answer to this question. I certainly have my own sort of pet theories about this. I will caveat total speculation, but I think that there's a potential link between green crab and Pacific oyster, which are technically invasive. But wild speculation, we would have to actually set up some sort of way to scientifically test that. I don't think we know that at this point. There has been pretty limited research on the impacts of green crab in British Columbia. And so we need to do a lot more to actually, make sure we understand those linkages.
Question for you regarding their range and the way in which they move. What are the constraints to them actually occupying new habitats? I mean, there must be a reason why the European green crab was #1 in Europe and was #2 in certain areas, perhaps temperature, salinity, certain conditions, etc. Why were they not found all over the world? And maybe as the corollary for that question, what are the constraints to them moving just up and occupying all coastal areas up and down the coast of British Columbia? Are there any impediments in British Columbia to their further distribution and movement?
Yes, so there absolutely are. Green crab, if you look at their distribution worldwide, you can see that they tend to inhabit temperate bands. They do well in Europe, so by extension, they do well on both the east and west coasts of British Columbia. And then similarly, they're established in South Africa and parts of South America, southern parts of South America, I should say. In terms of what constrains them in British Columbia, they are habitat generalists and they can live in a wide range of salinities and temperatures. So really what constrains them here, we believe, are our native crabs. We have these big, mean native crabs that outcompete and eat green crabs. So to simplify it, basically tend to inhabit those rocky intertidal habitats, and that keeps green crab out of those habitats. They also they just generally don't do as well in wave exposed habitats. And then we have these big Dungeness that as soon as they outside it, basically within habitat, and that keeps to green crab. And this tends to keep them from going particularly deep here. They can occur much deeper. They are considered much more subsidized. But here in the, something is keeping them out of deeper waters, and we suspect it's Dungeness crab.
Very interesting. And just a question here regarding ballast, the way in which international trade and shipping has created a conveyor belt to deliver larval forms of many different species of invertebrates around the world. Do you think that this might, I think about Vancouver, let's say, or southern British Columbia. I think about these crabs being mobile invertebrates. They're able to move up the coast to basically through their own means. And then I think about us as humaners with vessel traffic, etc. Do you have a sense as to what really promoted their coastal British Columbia, which vehicle, which way that they entered and successfully moved into this area?
Sure. You're cutting out a bit, so I'm going to interpolate the question a little bit. But I think if the question is what facilitated their spread, again, they spread through larval dispersal. And the reason we saw them come from the United States in 1997, 1998 was because that was an El Nino year. Waters were much warmer, larvae had higher survival, and the currents were just so that it really pushed them up the west coast of Vancouver Island. And if we look, it's hard. Crab populations are notoriously, they fluctuate quite wildly. It's like every year where we have really warm waters, we do seem to see a spike in green crab after that. So every year that we have another El Nino, like the blob year in 2015 was a good year for green crab. Again, this is something that we could probably connect a bit better with more research, but it certainly seems that warm water is very good for green crab.
Very interesting, and certainly some waters are getting warmer as we speak. I've got another question here from the chat room. Is there a known limiting factor in green crab populations? Now, you spoke a little bit to that, but the second question is more pointed. Have their populations in places you mentioned in the Atlantic or in California continued to grow at an exponential rate?
Sure. Yeah, there are a few locations that I know of on the Atlantic coast that also have these this hyper abundant thing going on. So we do see that elsewhere. It's because green crab tend to be they're shore crab. They're quite gregarious and they can live in high densities. That said, at some point, they do get a bit cannibalistic. So there's some sort of there's a cannibalism element to it that might help reduce the population numbers. That said, probably the biggest limitation on their population size in their native habitat is parasitism. Lots of shore crabs are controlled, the population is controlled by parasites. And that is the case for shore crabs in Europe. Unfortunately, green crab here do not have the same parasite load, and so they are released from that parasitism. So it's really just, at that point, it gets to the point of either resource competition or cannibalism.
Fascinating. I've got a request here from the chat room. Would you mind putting a crab photo up again for a minute? So perhaps
Absolutely.
We'll get a crab photo up there. I think just remind people what they're looking like. We can continue with the questions. Yeah, terrific. So a question here from the audience: who or what eats a green crab?
Great question. This is a subject of great interest. The one species that I know definitively for sure eats green crab on our coast are otters, both river otters and sea otters. There have been observations of both species eating green crab in California, where they're invasive, and anecdotal reports of sea otters eating them up in Carcinus Sound. So for sure, otters quite like green crab. I think they're just the right size. They're kind of like the Doritos of crabs. So otters really like them. I suspect bears would probably go for them if they got their hands on them. Same with gulls. Basically anything that eats eats our native shore crabs would probably be able to handle a green crab, a smaller green crab. That said, this has not been studied. Nobody has actually gone to do predation studies on what eats green crab. In their native habitat, they are also eaten by otters.
Great, thank you. Ask the same thing and observe that she takes it that humans do not, but I put it out there. That is a potentially interesting question, because what better way to tackle the threat or take advantage of the threat from invasive species than to open up a fishery on it when people actually see economic or nutritional value in removing that predator. This doesn't look like a very meaty crab, but have you ever eaten one?
I have not. I know people who have. And the report is they taste meh, and the amount of effort that goes into getting that meat is just not worth it not worth it. Especially when we have such big, delicious crabs on our coast. Why would you? So there's not a lot of economic ways we can use green crab. That said, people are trying. People are definitely trying to come up with a way to monetize catching green crab. I would add as a sort of personal concern around this is that anytime you monetize an invasion, you make that lucrative, and it can backfire in the sense that then you want that invasive species to stick around. And we see this with shellfish in BC. At least 3 of the shellfish that we harvest regularly and quite enjoy and eat all the time and are really important parts of our economy are in fact not native and invasive in the coast. And you would never ever hear people say, oh, let's eradicate Pacific oyster. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Thanks for that, Brett. From the chat room here, you mentioned that green crab have direct impacts on prey species in addition to their impacts on eelgrass. Is there concerns emanating from coastal Indigenous communities regarding food security? If so, if not, how might communities that don't have green crab yet mitigate the threat of their invasion?
Right. So I will say that we have First Nation partners working on this issue and invested in this all around the coast of British Columbia, and they have been excellent in terms of being bellwethers and letting us know when they show up. Perfect example being, of course, the arrival of green crab on Haida Gwaii. And food security is a leading issue because green crab do go after clams that we and First Nations harvest on the regular. So green crab are concerned for food security. Now, that said, I don't think at this point in British Columbia, we haven't done enough detailed study to figure out how many clams a green crab eats and how quickly and what size. And so that study is sort of something that we see doing. We would like to see done in the future for sure, because it would be good to put a number on that risk. Now, that said, we should act in a precautionary manner, certainly. And if a green crab is detected, that's the best time. That early detection phase is the best time to do the eradication trapping. It's very hard to get rid of green crab once they're there in really, really big numbers. But when there are still very few of them, it's possible to eradicate them from a site. And again, this goes back to, we can't trap them out everywhere, but we can focus on trapping them out in places where we have a high chance of success, and places where we are most concerned about green crab being. And certainly clam beds are one of those locations.
Got it. Thank you. You mentioned native species of crabs at different depths, at different zones within the coastal region in British Columbia. Question here from the chat room is, what native crab habitats are the green crabs taking over? In other words, is there kind of a competitive angle, or is this just all about the green crab coming in and upsetting the balance and turning up eelgrass beds? Are there impacts for native crab species? And if so, what does that look like and what's that lead to?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the one that interests me personally the most is the interaction between green crab and Dungeness. Dungeness get very big, but for a while they're quite small, and they are actually smaller than green crab. And some early research that we did a few years ago suggests that green crab will outcompete juvenile Dungeness for quite a while. And the unfortunate thing about that is that, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, juvenile Dungeness also rely on eelgrass and these intertidal habitats because they are also trying to avoid those big Dungeness at depth. So they are definitely overlapping, and that is a concern. Certainly, again, I keep repeating it, but it's something that we would like to research in more detail. But I suspect that there is an interaction, and there's literature to suggest that it is a negative interaction for Dungeness to a certain size. There's also a little bit of literature out of California that suggests that our native shore crabs, so the purple shore crab and the hairy shore crab, the sort of smaller ones, those are our native shore crab, and they are, as you can see from the picture, much smaller than the invasive shore crab. And so in California, they've seen a huge drop-off in these shore crab numbers in response to increasing green crab numbers. Whether that's a predation thing or a competition thing, I don't think we know.
Thank you. You've mentioned this several times, and I know in the chat room, our hostess has put the email site for sightings. But just to reiterate here, as we aim towards the conclusion of this great seminar event, what would you recommend we do if we come across crabs? So just refocus, repitch, and make it very clear. What do we do as human observers in the coastal zone if we see a green crab or a suspected green crab?
Great. Thank you for getting me to go back over that. Like I said, there is the AIS email hotline that you're welcome to email. If you didn't write it down and you've forgotten what it was, you can also just email me. I will get it to the right people because the right people is me and my manager. And so we will have that information. The most useful thing you can do is take photos and a GPS location if you can. Photos and good quality photos are really useful because we want to confirm the ID, and without having the actual specimen, we need good photos. Fortunately, green crab, it's usually fairly easy to identify them. Once you've looked at 1,500 of them, you get a knack for it. But a good photo is very useful for us. Note obviously the time and location as well. green crab are not the only invader on our coast. There are others. And there are resources out there, DFO resources, that'll explain those in more detail. Really any species that you suspect might be invasive, you're welcome to send that to that AIS email. For green crab, the only sort of additional thing that I'll add is that we are aware of them on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They've got a really wide distribution there. So we're particularly interested if you spot them in either the Salish Sea or anywhere along the mainland coast up to the central coast and Haida Gwaii. Those are all places where they're spreading, and so we're really interested in those sightings in particular.
Right. So just wondering, when you look at the European green crab in coastal British Columbia, does your mind zoom in on the concept of, hey, it's an invasive species or a non-indigenous species? Or does your mind go to, hey, aren't we humans changing the way in which species are distributed around the world? Or, hey, climate change is changing conditions for marine life, opening up new habitats to new species. What is kind of your go-to triage on your rational brain as a human observer of what's going on when you see the green crab? What comes immediately to mind? Is it a natural thing? Is it because of humans? Is it because of an indirect climate trigger? What is it that really galvanizes your thinking and your explanation for these occurrences?
Sure. For me, it's the intersection, as I said up top, it's the intersection between just pure fascinating science. If you take away all of the value and personal ethical concerns around green crab, from a scientific perspective, from an ecological perspective, they're fascinating. You're dropping a completely new element into an ecosystem that's evolved for millions of years. You're dropping this totally new element, and that perturbation is really interesting. What happens? What interactions change? What shifts? So, from a purely scientific perspective, they're just interesting in that respect. But for me, that is tempered by the fact that as humans, we're responsible for our actions. And whether we mean to or not, we are spreading species around the globe, and they are having impacts. They're having impacts for ecosystems, but they're having impacts for people too. And we're responsible for that. And it's our job to understand and mitigate the things that we have changed. It's not enough just to be curious about it. We need to also address it. So it's that intersection between policy and pure curiosity for me.
Well, very much, Brett, for a very personable and personal journey through PhD and through what you're doing now and what you love. So thanks very much for your time today. Congratulations on being the 2019 Ocean Award winner for outstanding research as a graduate student. So thank you for being you, and thank you for telling us your story and sharing these thoughts with us today. We're going to wrap it up there and get on with our new lives during this COVID-19 misadventure, I might say. And congratulations again on this. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Danica and Amanda for helping to showcase these events. And I just want to end with a bit of a shout out to next week's lecture, same time, same place, same time meaning 1 p.m. Next Thursday, October the 22nd, same place meaning on your computer at home or wherever you're able to join us. Next week, Dr. Tom Dakin will be accepting the award bestowed upon him in 2019, and that is the Conservation Technology Award. So join us for a very interesting dialogue with Tom, who will tell us about his work, really looking at the intersection of marine technology and his ability to steward and facilitate conversations around underwater noise and what this means to sea life, what this means in terms of human activities, and what this means in terms of the conservation narrative. So we look forward to greeting Tom Dakin next Thursday afternoon. We look forward to each and every one of you joining us again for these free online events. We thank you for your attention and your support of these wonderful custodians of our ocean. So thanks, Brett. Take care, and we'll see you all next week.